Welcome to the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations Events podcast, where we bring you the audio from our public programs, featuring in-depth analysis of topics on China from scholars, journalists, authors, and policymakers. For more interviews, videos, and links to events like this one, visit us at www.ncuscr.org.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nitai Daitel, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for such an important conversation at this critical juncture in the bilateral relationship. We are delighted today to partner with the World Trade Centers Association and put on our important program. Small and medium-sized enterprises have provided crucial ballast to the bilateral relationship for decades. While the Biden administration's foreign policy for the middle class is a departure in tone from President Trump's America First rhetoric, we have not yet seen substantive changes in China trade policy. With tariffs remaining in place and the path forward for SMEs uncertain, we've convened today's program to explore what current policies vis-a-vis China mean for American SMEs and to understand how those actively engaged in the day-to-day of the bilateral economic relationship have been faring through these turbulent times. We are joined here today by four terrific panelists. I will only briefly introduce them now as their full bios are posted on our event page, with the link you can see posted in the chat. First, Gary Bean is the chair of the board of the World Trade Center of Greater Philadelphia and partner and chair of the China Business Group and International Group at White & Williams LLP. Second, Ron Bracalente is the third generation president and CEO of privately owned Bracalente Manufacturing Group. For more than 70 years, Bracalente has specialized in global manufacturing solutions with an emphasis on machining and mechanical assembly, with plants in the United States and China and offices in India and Vietnam. Next, Amy Selico is a principal at the Albright Stonebridge Group and leads the firm's DC-based China practice. Previously, Ms. Selico served as Senior Director for China Affairs at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Finally, Linda Conlon is president at the World Trade Center of Greater Philadelphia. Previously, she served as vice chair and first vice president for the Export-Import Bank of the United States and worked at the Department of Commerce. This afternoon, we will first have a discussion among our experts and leave ample time for audience questions. To ask a question, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen and type it in. Please include your name and affiliation and to specify to whom you are directing your question if applicable. Please note that the chat function is disabled. We will only use it to post resources and links pertinent to the discussion. Also, please note that this meeting is on the record and being recorded to be posted on our website later. Before we jump into the discussion, I would like to turn it over to Robin van Puynbroek, Executive Director of Business Development at the World Trade Centers Association, for a few introductory words. Robin, take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you, and good afternoon from New York. I am Robin van Puynbroek, Executive Director of Business Development here at the World Trade Centers Association. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event. The WTCA is an international trade organization with a mission to facilitate international trade and development, but also to promote intercultural understanding. We have over 300 World Trade Centers in nearly 100 countries in our global network, many in China and in the United States. So our World Trade Centers, in turn, represent many thousands of companies, many of which are small and medium enterprises. So we advocate for much needed reform of the international trade infrastructure, so it can actually work for everyone and to be more inclusive, especially for SMEs around the world, who are true engines of the economy. Now, with a digital globalization emerging, we are witnessing imbalances and disruptions now in international trade. And it is exactly the US-China relationship that will need to provide a solid basis for stability globally. So I'm therefore very grateful for today's program and for the wonderful partnership with the National Committee on US-China Relations. And I wanted to thank both the teams at the National Committee and the WTCA for making the program happen. And a big thank you also to our guests for being so generous with their time. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and I look forward to further developing our partnership here. It is now my pleasure to hand it over to our moderator for today, Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee. With an impressive career in both public and private sectors, Steve can pull from his extensive experience from Carlisle to being part of the team that actually helped establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. So thank you again, and over to you, Steve.
Robin, thanks, and thank everybody for joining us today. I have the very pleasurable duty today of not having to speak, but just moderating with 4 outstanding panelists. So our thought is to kind of start at almost the macro level and the Washington level, and then bring it down to kind of what's really happening to SMEs. And that we can do this with the World Trade Center Association is terrific. It's the first of what I hope will be a deepening partnership. But Amy, why don't we start with you? Kind of what's going on in DC with respect to kind of, trade and SMEs vis-a-vis China.
Thanks so much, Steve. It is terrific to be here to speak today about this really important bilateral relationship, and of course, the impact on SMEs as well as the contribution of SMEs to U.S.-China trade. I think everybody on this call understands the robust and very important history of U.S.-China trade ties. Trading goods alone in 2020 exceeded $600 billion between the United States and China. And that just demonstrates the real value to American producers exporting to China, as well as the real value to American consumers and American companies in importing goods from China. But I think we all know that. And so I thought in setting the stage, I would really focus on the continued downward trajectory in US-China trade and investment ties. From my perch here in Washington, D.C., focused on the way that, in fact, the Biden administration and Congress are continuing to frame US-China trade ties through the lens of enhanced competition, not only in trade relationships, but certainly impacting US-China economic ties. Trade may have once been, of course, one of the stabilizing forces in US-China, in the overall US-China relationship, often called the ballast stabilizing force in the trade relationship. But today, of course, it continues to be the tip of the spear of an increasingly contentious relationship between the US and China. And this has been true for almost 5 years now, and of course made much worse with the start of the trade war by the last administration, and of course impacting all of us on this call through the application of tariffs by the US and retaliatory tariffs by the Chinese government. As everybody in this webinar understands, those tariffs continue to be a real drag on US-China trade and on the US-China relationship, but they are very difficult for the Biden folks to attack early on, to eliminate because of the political pressures, both in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing on the national governments in talking about where and how the US-China relationship should change. And so I think we all have to understand that it's safe to assume that in 2021 and going forward, we are going to continue to see intense competition and contention between the US and China, specifically on trade issues, based on how the Biden administration, Congress, and Beijing are continuing to pursue policies that really are pushing for some decoupling of our two economies. Already, even though its overall China review is still underway, the Biden administration has demonstrated a real comfort in continuing to take a tough line against China on economic issues. Over the past week, as I'm sure you've all seen, there have been 2 executive orders, one of which will continue to restrict the ability of Americans to invest in some Chinese companies, and a second executive order which will continue scrutiny of Chinese companies operating in the United States that hold US user data. And so US-China trade tensions, like tensions in the overall relationship, are going to increasingly play out not only between Washington and Beijing, but on the global stage. And that's why we're also intently focused on what's happening in Europe this week, the G7, as well as at the EU, US, as well as NATO summits. My final point, just in talking about this overall environment, is that as we look at US-China trade ties, domestic politics in both of our countries, both Washington and Beijing, are going to continue to be real constraints on some kind of rehabilitation of US-China trade relations. Since I'm here in Washington, D.C., I'll just, of course, remind everybody on the call that in a town that agrees on nothing, Democrats and Republicans are coming together to pursue tougher restrictions on economic activity between the US and China. And the Biden administration is increasingly, I believe, constrained by that pressure from Democrats and Republicans on Congress to continue to be tough on China. And instead of trying to rehabilitate US-China trade ties, continue to maintain some restrictions on the ability of the trade relationship to grow. Let me stop there, Steve. There's so much more to cover, but I think hopefully that at least frames the overall relationship as it stands right now.
I think it does. It gives us, I think, a perfect overview of it. So let me then turn to Gary and Linda. Talk about kind of the view of this from organizations like the World Trade Council Association, and how you're viewing this, and then what you can do to kind of, in a way, make it easier for your members to continue to benefit from trade with China. Linda first.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. And I want to thank the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations for this opportunity to participate along with my board chair, Gary Bean, and Ron Bracalente, one of our outstanding members of the World Trade Center of Greater Philadelphia, and also to thank Robin van Peyenbroek of the World Trade Centers Association. As a World Trade Center, we're located in Center City, Philadelphia. We're one of over 300 World Trade Centers in some 100 countries. We work with businesses, largely small and medium-sized companies, and that's why this discussion today has so much relevance for us. We work with, on average, between actively 200 to 300 companies per year, helping them to accelerate their global business growth in countries around the world. We've been doing that for nearly 2 decades. And during that time, we have helped companies to increase their export sales collectively by about $2 billion, that's with a B, $2 billion. So we're quite proud of that record. And China is a very important market for us. If we look at the greater Philadelphia area, which is southeastern Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey, it is the 5th largest market right now for us, representing on average about $1 billion worth of export sales alone. We have a number of companies, including Bracalente, who are very active in China, who do business with China, have operations in China. And so consequently, we have put together what we call the China Club, where companies meet, they gather, they share best practices, challenges, problems, solutions, and they basically learn from one another. So being able to trade freely and fairly with China is very important to us as an organization and to our companies. And one last point that I'll make, we are part of the World Trade Centers Association, which is a powerful network. In China alone, they have some 38 World Trade Centers in Greater China, the Greater China region, 34 on the mainland. And what that means is that we have an office there to help and facilitate business for our companies in China and to help them participate in major trade shows with whom we work with trade show organizers in Shanghai, in Xi'an, and in Beijing on 3 major shows per year. So it's another opportunity to do business with one another. So consequently, the discussions today very, very important to our individual member organizations and companies.
Let me go to Gary with kind of the same question, and also talk about, I don't know if you have this data, how many jobs in the Philadelphia area actually are created or maintained because of exports to China? Gary.
Now, I know with respect to the work that we do at the World Trade Center, and Linda, correct me if my numbers are off, but through the work that we've done in the Philadelphia region, we've generated, I believe it's 26,000, it may be more jobs. So we really make a difference. And just to echo some of the points that Linda made, one of the I think most positive features of our China Operations Club is the peer-to-peer nature. And so what we do is we look at topical issues, we bring in speakers, and we learn from one another. And it's a great way to get a better understanding of how to succeed in China. We provided this club because there was a great deal of activity between our region and China. Initially, that activity was much more supply-based, more supply chain driven. But I've noticed, and very clearly, over the years that has pivoted, and many of our members, if not most of our members, are really engaged in pursuing the marketplace in China. And that's another way that the World Trade Center assists our members. As Linda said, China has a large network of World Trade Centers. Philadelphia has a sister city relationship with Tianjin. Tianjin is about a 45-minute high-speed line ride outside of Beijing and the 5th largest city in China. And that sister city relationship goes back for many, many decades. One of the things that we were able to do, but now very limited under the current climate, was, as Linda said, we would sponsor groups, business groups that would come in, organized through the World Trade Center in Tianjin, and they'd be looking to connect with our member companies to engage in business, both inbound and outbound. And similarly, we would go to China. I've personally been to Tianjin, I believe, about 30 times. And I would go in my capacity as chairman of the board. And we would represent our companies. We'd bring some of our companies with us, and we would meet. The latest meeting was in the medical products arena, and again, try to bring together companies. And it had been very successful. It was a business to business level. And now, of course, as much because of the pandemic, but also because of the chilling of the relationships, we haven't had that type of in-person engagement. And we're hoping that we can kind of settle down in the relationship with China and go back to that, because we've had many successes that resulted out of that business to business, person to person engagement.
Do you think after travel is allowed that will continue, or has the relationship so deteriorated that it would be hard to run the kinds of almost trade shows that you've done historically, trade shows that generate jobs in the Philadelphia area?
I don't think it has. I believe it will continue, and let me explain why with a caveat. Many of the relationships that have been built between the cities are decades long. And those strong relationships, including the relationships that our member companies have, they will survive. They're in a sense under the radar of what's happening at the national level. And I'm confident, and we'll talk a little later, I believe, on the actual experiences, and Ron will tell his actual experience, that while it's tested, it will continue. I think what's more challenging, as I know most everyone knows who's tuning in today, most everything in China has a government component. And so some of the relationships that we've established for 10 years, while we still have emails back and forth, I don't know if they will be permitted to engage at the same level once travel is permitted. It's an open question. I'm confident, because of the strong interpersonal relationships that we've built, that both sides will attempt to make that happen. But as I believe everybody's aware with China, there are certain things that have to get approved before they can happen. So, Steve, I think time will tell on that front.
And last question, then I want to go to Ron to kind of take it. We're going down level by level now to the operating level. Is the 26,000 for all exports or exports to China?
Linda, I'm going to let you chime in on that to see if I have my numbers correct.
These are all exports. In other words, we assist companies on an annual basis, provide trade counseling, educational programs, and then they document on a year-by-year basis how much they've registered in export sales. But the short answer to that, that's across many countries.
And with China you said it was the 5th largest market for Philadelphia area businesses?
Exactly.
At what percentage, roughly? 20, 25%, 15, 10?
I would say probably in the range of 15 to 20%. And that's just a guess.
So somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000, 7,000 jobs. Yeah. So it's material.
And Steve, I'll just add on that our China Operations Club it is our largest dedicated club of companies, and we have perhaps 30, 35 active members, and they are the companies that are generating the revenue and generating the jobs.
Ron, so let's go to somebody who's the front lines, we would call you. Talk about what this downturn, talk about your business with China, talk about what the downturn in the trade relationship has meant for your business and what you think the consequences are for folks in the Philadelphia area.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for including me in this panel. I feel honored to be able to speak with all of you and the guests that are participating. So I guess it's important for me to start maybe with the first trip that I took to China back in 2003. Similar to the World Trade Association, we belong to a national trade association for metalworking, and they put together a trade mission back in 2003, which I was one of 60 people that went on that trade mission. I believe it was 45 or 50 companies, and the companies were all very similar to ours. Here we're a family business. I'm third generation, predominantly in the metalworking field. But the idea of the trade mission was to go to China to see companies, and they set it up, sort of in a unique way. We started out with very old and sort of antiquated companies, and every day the companies got a little better and better to a point where, the first night sitting around the bar, we all were saying to each other, like, we don't have anything to worry about. This is all good. And then by this third or fourth night, we're all looking at each other with sort of a different stare. But the evenings were filled with laughter and cultural experiences. The Chinese companies, the leadership of those companies that we had visited during the day joined us for their typical traditional Chinese meals. And that was a real taste of the culture. And I think that's, a big part of the trade mission at that time. And it goes to Gary's point about how valuable, that ability to go back and forth and visit, our countries and to see really what's going on. Because you can get on the news, you can read, but nothing is going to, give you that experience like a face-to-face meeting. So really, that's how it started for us. Up until that point, we'd say 50 years of our 70 years, we were, a local company supporting local customers. And, this was a decision that we had to make. We did realize shortly thereafter that a lot of our customers had gone to China and set up companies. And I think the biggest thing that you heard of back then was, access to the low cost and labor. But the companies that really were smart about it were there because of the market. And we put together a plan and we followed up on it, started with supply chains, and then we developed our own plant in 2008. So, I would say that to answer your question, business is business, politics are politics. How things have changed, I mean, you guys covered a lot of it, but Gary hit it on the head. The relationships that we built, 10, 20 years ago are not going to change. I think it's really, really difficult to develop and build new relationships, but to maintain the relationships that we have. I mean, I am missing China. It'll be 2 years this November since I've been there. I've tallied about 50 some trips over the years. And, it's difficult. My general manager in our plant over there says you're not going to recognize the place when you get here. We're in a growth strategy and mode right now, coming off the pandemic. As that got under control, immediately the economy started to really kick in. So I think, our business strategy is really focused on the customer, focused on, what is it that the customer wants. And we had a lot of customers back in the 90s and the early 2000s basically saying, we need to have a spend of, north of 50% in low cost regions. We lost business here in the United States as a result of it. So we followed our customers to China, and that's what expanded our business. So the things that I think we all are in front of us today, if that was the case back then, we probably wouldn't be in China. I'll leave you with that.
I mean, if the kind of the atmosphere of the relationship was this difficult, you just wouldn't, as a small business, you just wouldn't take the step of trying to.
Yeah, I mean, to Gary's point, exactly. I mean, obviously, with COVID, we can't travel there right now, but effectively without a long quarantine. But yeah, I mean, I really do believe that it would be difficult. So I mean, on a local level, the Chinese government's open arms, welcoming foreign investment. They realized, I think, in order to get their low class to a middle class, they needed to do it on the back of foreign investment, and that's evident. I mean, it's a huge. But along with that, comes these companies that realize they need to be where the market is, and there's very few products that are growing faster than they are in Asia around the rest of the world. So that's the reason to be there. That's why we're there. We're serving our customers, and through that, the business to business relationships, you can have the same thing. Both sides can win. Where I think on the political landscape, we're both after the same thing. So it's more of a contentious relationship.
Did the tariffs and the downturn in the tone of the relationship affect your business, or it just continued and you don't have a lot of product moving across national lines, so it was okay? That you wouldn't start again if the relationship is what it is today, but basically it didn't have an enormous effect on you.
I've got two stories to support that. So, in one case, our customers that realized they could import a finished product and avoid the tariffs did that. So our business lost, the parts part of that equation, and the U.S. company lost the assembly of it, and so other local parts that were procured domestically. So in the cases of products that could be, manufactured complete and shipped into the United States, they were able to do that. And today you can still do that and avoid the tariff completely, as long as it's a finished product ready to go to the retail store. So that definitely hurt our business, and it hurt a lot of companies here in the U.S. as well.
So it was the tariffs that we put on, or it was the retaliatory tariffs that the Chinese put on?
No, it's a 301 tariff. Yeah, the 301 tariff.
Our tariffs.
Yeah.
But also to that point, Steve, and I spoke, and Gary spoke with other members of our China club informally, about 7 of them, that they acknowledge that tariffs are impacting their business, particularly those retaliatory tariffs on China's part, elevating the cost of goods going into China. And some of them, as a result, are looking at other markets and depending less on the China market, as an example. But there are other challenges that they're facing, not only in China, but worldwide, but particularly in China. Shipping costs are increasing the cost of their products. They continue to rise, and it's costing companies time and money. Recently, there was an outbreak of COVID in Shenzhen. One company reported they're at 30% capacity. So they're looking at other smaller ports in the area as a result, but that's another way that costs are increasing, and commodity prices as well are increasing the costs.
Was there a reduction for any of the 4 of you? Was there a reduction in employment in the United States as a result of those tariffs?
our business model changed here in the U.S. So we were actually able to grow our business. So we turned and pivoted our business more towards regulated industries, things that had to be made in the United States versus, you know, industrial products that could be made anywhere. We didn't unhook those relationships because those relationships we had for 40 or 50 years. But, you know, when you hear a customer telling you, now these are corporate companies, OEMs that are, you know, New York Stock Exchange companies telling you that they have to shift 60% of their spend into low-cost regions, you know, the handwriting's on the wall. So that was going on across, I mean, the whole entire industrial space. So, you know, that was a business decision that we made. So we stick to regulated industries here and parts that are marketed with the Made in USA tag on them. And that's all we'll manufacture now here in the States. So it has actually, you know, stabilized our business to a point, and then now it's growing. I mean, our business is growing about, you know, 20 to 30% overall this year, because we're also a global company that can support our customers' needs, and we have a very, very good staff and very experienced a global workforce here that can make decisions. You know, the freight and logistics as an example. We've developed sourcing in India and Vietnam long before the pandemic and the tariffs. So, you know, we can flex into those regions as a result. But China's still, even with the tariff, in some cases, still competitive. They've got very mature supply chains, and they have know-how that's not easily replaced.
Gary, talk about you're obviously in your China practice, in your law firm, you've got a lot of clients who've got a lot of experiences with what's gone on. Talk about what's happened to your clients.
Yeah, and just really to follow up on what Ron said, you know, I think the answer is it depends on your question on job loss and how it impacts the clients and the companies, including our member companies, World Trade Center, doing business in China. Some of our companies have been able to absolutely dollar for dollar just take the tariff cost that they've been experiencing and pass it along to their end user. But they are in industries where there are no other opportunities. You know, for example, we have a member in the specialty chemical business, and some of the components of what they produce here in the U.S., the only resources are available in China right now. So all of that market is going through the same thing, so they can pass along the price increase. We've had some clients that were able to push some of the price increase from tariffs back on the supplier, but you have to have the leverage to be able to do that. And you also have to have that strong relationship. But that's the exception. We've had other clients that, you know, really have not only struggled with the tariffs, but it's really, as Linda was saying, it's really a perfect storm for many companies now in the United States. There's real inflationary pressure. Linda listed, you know, some of the component parts, but, you know, energy is a piece of that as well. And then, you know, you look at, you know, some of the labor shortages that people are seeing here. You know, so there are a lot of challenges out there. Tariffs, that's a part of it. Just to echo what Ron was saying about, you know, having alternative supply sources, Ron was ahead of the curve. A lot of the companies, particularly the smaller companies, just weren't in the position to dual source or have alternative sources. And one of the challenges we're hearing from some of the small mid-sized companies, it takes years and years to develop those relationships. And so a lot of the companies we work with, they are going to stay with their supply chain in China. But this was a wake-up call, and they're looking to Vietnam. They're looking to India, but then again, they can't travel there. And you know, and I spoke to one of our members, and you know, and he said, Gary, you know, you remember it took us 2 to 3 years to find the right partner to have that relationship building. So it's a challenging time, and certainly tariffs are not helping the climate that a lot of companies are facing that are doing international work.
That raises, Linda, go ahead.
Yes, sir. And to your point, Gary, in talking with some of our companies that are looking to other sources in Southeast Asia. In fact, we now have an Indian Southeast Asia club for those members as well. Many of them said, look, if it's pretty sophisticated manufacturing, it's not like we can shut off the lights, move stuff very easily and change very quickly, as Gary said. There's a cost that comes to that, and I'm sure Ron would agree with that. If it's less sophisticated manufacturing, then they possibly might consider a move to other parts in Asia or Southeast Asia. But again, there you have to be certain that the supply chains have the capacity and they're adequate for the company involved. But I do think that as a rule, all of them have expressed that business, as you know, hates uncertainty. And the uncertainty on the level of our bilateral relationships certainly has an impact on their future strategy as well. But they're not ready to pick up and leave right away. There's a cost to that as well.
I mean, Gary raised the inflation question, and this question then I think is for Amy. You know, the data this morning, we have really fairly rapidly increasing costs, and a lot of it is manufacturing input. We have wage pressure, a bunch of things. How will that play? And this is a question actually from Pin Ni, who's the CEO of Wanxiang America, an automotive parts company in Ohio and Illinois and you know, basically in the Midwest. Not in Philadelphia, to my knowledge, but who knows? It's a big company. Will this inflationary pressure force the Biden administration to end the tariffs? Because one way you relieve inflation would be get rid of the tariffs.
Yeah, that is absolutely logical. I think the challenge from here in Washington is what's driving the continuation of tariffs. I don't think anybody even here in Washington believes that the tariffs are going to bring China to the table to make concessions in the trade relationship, the reason for the initial application. And so the challenge for us here in Washington in advocating for those tariffs to be removed is I believe the political leaders in the Biden administration don't want to give up, quote unquote, leverage in eventual trade negotiations with the Chinese. Now, on the positive side, I know I'm doom and gloom here. We heard today that Secretary Raimondo also spoke with her Chinese counterpart overnight. And that's in addition to Ambassador Tai and Secretary Yellen already having spoken to their shared counterpart in China about US-China economic relations and the trade relationship. Unfortunately, not a lot of talk about restarting dialogue, but that is a really important foundational step that all three of these economic agencies have now engaged with their Chinese counterparts. And Steve, you have to believe that for Secretary Raimondo, who is so focused on economic revitalization here in the United States, that she understands that these tariffs are a tax on Americans, both consumers as well as producers. And given this inflationary pressure, this is not good for what the Biden administration has said is one of its top priorities. And of course, that's economic revitalization. But we have to be patient and wait for those trade talks to restart, because I think it is very unlikely there will be a unilateral lifting of tariffs before we actually engage with the Chinese, because we want to see, of course, those retaliatory tariffs also.
Are the tariffs leverage, Amy? You sat at USTR, I guess both for Amy and Linda. Do you think that they're leverage?
No, I don't think that they're leverage. I do think that they are low-hanging fruit. When we talk about how the US and China could come together and have some early wins in a commercial dialogue, taking those tariffs off is clearly good for the US economy and for the Chinese economy. But we have to meet, we have to see progress. And again, I think that that could be one area of early progress, is removing those tariffs. But again, Steve, I know I've already said it, but I'm going to say it probably a few more times. the Biden administration is under enormous pressure here in Washington to maintain tough policies on China. And so in order for them to see a removal of tariffs as absolutely critical, they have to hear from us. The business community has to talk about how worker-centric trade policy, it needs to include tariff relief because workers are being harmed by these tariffs.
Linda?
Exactly, and that relates to really making certain that small business has a voice. Large businesses, large corporations have, with all due respect, Gary, have hundreds of attorneys and lawyers to advocate for policies that they think would benefit them, but we need to make sure that small businesses continue to have a voice. Tariffs aren't the only issues that are on the table or that are part of the bilateral discussion. We've heard for years the issue of intellectual property protection, the forced transfer of technology, among many other issues that are important to small businesses as well. And this is what we're hearing from our small businesses. So we hope that in addition to tariffs, those are going to be part of the discussion. I agree with Amy. They should be retained, but that they're not the complete answer to ameliorating the bilateral relationship.
It would take 10 minutes among people of goodwill to end the tariffs that were imposed by the Trump administration, and China would instantaneously end its retaliatory tariffs. It would take 10 minutes to do, no joke. I mean, it's not really, I wouldn't need a high-priced lawyer to do it. It just could be done. Clearly, that's not on the table. That's, or else we would have seen movement. So what is it? Is it what Linda is suggesting, Amy, that we need to get additional intellectual property rights protection? Is it going to be subsidies of state-owned enterprises? Is it going to be, making sure that companies like RON are treated exactly the same as a Chinese company, kind of national treatment issues? What would satisfy the United States so we can get these tariffs, which I believe not only hurt American workers, but hurt working families much more than rich people? So, when we talk to Walmart and, they have, I think what Gary said, they passed along most of the increase in prices. Now, if you're rich, you kind of go, an extra $400 or $500 is not a big deal. If you're making, $25,000 a year, that's really material. So it's so unfair to kind of working families, and the Biden administration talks so much about this. So I don't quite what's going to be the plan from USTR to kind of get these things removed?
Well, I completely agree with Linda. It's from the Biden administration's perspective, the tariffs are a tool. They're not an issue to be solved. They're a tool to try to push China to make progress on longstanding problems. And so in addition to forced technology transfer and inadequate enforcement of intellectual property rights in China, I do think another two that really are concerning to this administration. One is the use of subsidies, Chinese subsidies that distort global markets. This is not just a bilateral issue. And then of course, continued market access restrictions. You mentioned it, Steve, this concept of reciprocity. So if the US economy is open to Chinese investment, why isn't China's market more open to our companies, investors on the ground in China? I really want to underscore what Ron said earlier on, and that is that the Chinese government is saying that in order to continue its economic development trajectory, remarkable economic development trajectory, including this year, they need foreign investors. And so that's an opportunity. But what I do think the Biden administration wants to hear explicitly from the Chinese government is, how are you going to address some of these market access restrictions and non-market barriers that continue to impede foreign investors in the market. In their latest survey, AmCham China said that the number one concern that American companies are facing in China right now is unequal treatment, that they are facing increasing discrimination. And they put the blame for that squarely on the deterioration in US-China relations. And so they are feeling more discriminated against. Now, these same companies don't want to leave the China market. And again, I think Ron was the one who made that point too, that despite all of these calls for decoupling that China and the US have started put policies in support of, we are not seeing European and American companies by and large, or Japanese companies for that matter, wanting to leave the market. Yes, more diversification, absolutely. But I think for our trade negotiators, Steve, they want to see the Chinese government continue to make commitments and live up to them that that demonstrates that the China market is open on equal terms and fair terms for American companies. We've heard Jake Sullivan say that that the Biden administration is not interested just in getting more access for Goldman Sachs in China. They want small and medium-sized enterprises to be able to benefit from the China market. They want American workers to benefit from US-China trade. And so I do think the Chinese government's going to have to give. And again, I think one of the results, if we can get some give there, is tariff relief. That could be something that happens as a result of it. But first, we need to have those conversations. We need to engage.
Is your business affected? Two questions. One, do you think you're given fair access to the Chinese market, given your investment there? Second, do you think are some of your competitors subsidized? So are there subsidies that flow from the state to a competitor, which reduces their cost and makes it more difficult for you to sell at a fair price?
All right, so I'll address those questions last first. So we have access to the same raw material pricing that a state-owned company would have. So, you know, what Amy was pointing out is the Chinese government continues to subsidize their raw materials. They did it extensively, you know, from the time that we started there till now. I think the only material that's still being subsidized significantly is steel. Aluminum was stopped really with the anti-dumping of 2011. And stainless steel and red metals, brass and copper are pretty much on par of what we would pay here in the U.S. But steel products, which is there's a lot in steel. I mean, agriculture, just to name one industry, is predominantly that. So, yeah, I mean, I don't see us having a disadvantage. We typically don't do business with Chinese-owned companies. We focus on foreign-owned entities that are in China. Just for all the reasons that you're mentioning. I think, you know, the Chinese handle business a little differently than foreigners do. It comes down more to the culture and to the respect of the supply chain. So I really can't answer that question, you know, with an example, you know, if we're getting treated or mistreated. I can tell you this, you know, at our 10-year anniversary, the local government, you know, came and insisted they sit next to me in our celebration. So that was interesting. And we got a plaque for paying the taxes in China. So, you know, we run our books the way we'd run them here. So we're not playing games. You know, we ended up, I guess, hitting a mark with paying some taxes there. But anyway, it's hard to say, you know, to your question there, the second one.
And Steve, if I could just jump in for a minute, because just hearing this discussion, and particularly the question of, you know, will I be treated fairly in China? You know, when we work with companies at the World Trade Center, you know, they look at, you know, the common theme is, if I make an investment, is it safe and can I get it back? 2, will I be treated the same as local companies? And then 3, will my intellectual property be protected? You know, when we're talking about China. And these are probably the same questions that Ron went through many years ago when they decided to go to China. I think the challenge now is, with the breakdown in the relationships and the back and forth that continues, I think it's more challenging for a company new to export or looking for other markets to put China down, which was always, or at least in the last 10 years or so, a natural because of the growing demands with the growing middle class. I think some of the now disconnect at the national level makes smaller companies question whether they want to go to China. I think the companies, and these are primarily the companies that we deal with that are there already, they can figure out ways to deal with it because they have strong relationships. But I'm more concerned about, is there going to be an expansion of companies going into China for the first time? And that's a lot of the companies that we work with at the World Trade Center.
With already the largest middle class in the world with increasing size, it sounds tragic that
Right.
we won't be able to create good jobs in the United States that can export our products to China's middle class and others. Why is that wrong? Or maybe everybody agrees. I'm sorry, Ron, you think that's right?
I think, the world's flattened out here, and, things that are going to get made economically and used in that region, I think makes sense. So we have that challenge here in America. Our cost structure, doesn't necessarily lend ourselves to being globally competitive when you're looking at not just China, but these other regions we're talking about in India and Vietnam. So to answer your question, I think, that's where policy and regulation, things that hold back U.S. manufacturing and companies. I mean, we've learned a lot, so it wasn't that long ago. I think the number one selling pickup truck in America is the F-150. The line was shut down because of the supply chain for computer chips, right? So why isn't there computer chips being made in America? This you can come up with a lot of examples. The pandemic, pointed to a lot of things that, used to be made in America that aren't made here anymore. I mean, I think there was a lot of people asleep at the wheel when these companies were just exiting, the country. So to Gary's point earlier, if you didn't have your eye on that, and a lot of, I can tell you right now, during the 80s and the 90s, while I was running this business, I wasn't really focused on the world markets. I never thought for a second I would be in China until, we lost a chunk of business here that was, significant. We had 6 machines. We had about 30 people. We got that infamous phone call, what's your inventory level from our customer? And, I asked, why are you moving the business? They said, well, I said, has our quality been, bad? Has our delivery been bad? No, everything's fine. I said, well, that only leaves price. They said, why didn't you give us the opportunity to quote it? And the numbers that they shared with me were less than the raw material that we were able to purchase here in the United States. So a lot of that has happened over to a point where, when I talked earlier, politics is politics, business is business. Businessmen have had to make decisions based on the customer. The customer is really dictating, what they want. And the example I gave you with one customer telling us that they needed a 60% spend, this was $100 billion spend, and 60% of it, they needed it to come from low-cost regions. So I didn't set that policy, the customers did. So, this was going on here for decades. I don't think any of us should be surprised where we're at right now. And the trajectory of China, we need to start thinking about how it's going to feel and be as as potentially the second largest economy. And if we don't watch ourselves, we'll get passed by India in a short time thereafter. So, I mean,
will be the second largest.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think that's going to happen no matter what we do.
Exactly. All it takes is
that's kind of what they say, baked in the cake.
Yep. The median income in China, all it has to do is get to 1/5 of the income here, and they're there.
Exactly. So this is for all of you, if you had 120 seconds with Catherine Tai, the United States Trade Representative, what would you tell her to do? Who wants to be the first one to kind of swing at that? Amy, since you're out of USTR, it's easiest for you, then the others can follow. Get a few minutes to think about it.
I would just encourage her to think about limiting national security and values and other considerations in the economic relationship. sometimes there is obviously some bleeding there happening, but it shouldn't be in every part of the trade relationship. And I think she could take a lesson from her predecessor, who was able to maintain a very good dialogue with his Chinese counterpart despite a trade war happening. Because I think Ambassador Lighthizer really did try to stick to trade issues in talking to his counterpart and not allow a lot of other issues to be included in trade discussions. And so that would be one piece of advice.
Linda?
And I would follow up with a couple of things, and this is not surprising that whether it's USTR or our trade negotiators within the Commerce Department at the International Trade Administration, to really pay attention to the voice of small business. Maybe that is self-evident from all of what we've been discussing this afternoon. But the perspective, while some things they're going to agree with larger corporations like the protection of intellectual property, there are some concerns that really are come from small business that need to really be recognized and addressed. And I think over the years, USTR has had a small business advocate or representative. Amy, you would know that as well. I know within the Commerce Department, we operated along with USTR committees made up of representatives. Ron, I would encourage, if it still exists, that you step up to the plate with your busy schedule so that you hear from small businesses throughout the country. And the second thing I would say is, let's not go it alone. Let's look to, it may sound simple, but let's see how we can go. You mentioned, Amy, the Japanese, the European companies there, to find agreement with our allies in how we can address these market access and other issues on behalf of our companies. And the third thing I'll say is, I look at the World Trade Center network that I talked about earlier in China, 38 World Trade Centers alone. And in some of these World Trade Centers, they are subsidiaries of the China Council for Promotion of International Trade, the CCPIT. So wouldn't it be great for small business and representatives from CCPIT to talk about what is in their mutual interest and hopefully have that percolate up to decision makers? Maybe that sounds like too much of a Pollyanna, but I would like to say that that could be a powerful resource.
Daria?
Yeah, I think I would look at it in a historic perspective. You know, since China opened up to the United States in '73, there's been incredible progress. I've been going to China since the late 1990s, and along, I know Ron has the same experience. I mean, you know, each trip got more exciting about how the relationship was developing, and more importantly, the opportunities, particularly as that middle class, started to grow. We have to get back to free trade and fair trade. Once we do that, we recognize that, we have made a lot of progress, and just the reality, we are the two economic engines in the in the world, and we have to coexist. And so, let's build on relations that have built and find a way to simplify it, get back to free trade. Earlier this week, I had the pleasure of speaking with a client, and a client that is known well at the National Committee, the Philadelphia Orchestra. We do their work on their tours in China, and they're going to be going back in 2053. 2023, I'm getting ahead of myself, for the 50-year anniversary of that performance that Nixon and Mao put together. And you look at the relations that have built, there's got to be a way to get back to a more even relationship on the trade side. But let's not ignore the progress that's been made over the years.
Ron, are people, you're not a business that one would have expected to go to China in a lot of ways. Are people in your community surprised when you say, "Oh, I've got this operation in China"? How do they respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question is why, that we get, a lot. And, and the answer is simple. I mean, I said it earlier, we follow our customers there. We also had quite a bit of damage, leading up to that with just losing chunks of business, over the 70 years of our existence, we never really lost business, certainly for not the wrong reasons. And I think that was the wake up call. When that happened, the first one was Black & Decker back in the late 90s. The DeWalt product line, the yellow product line, was exclusively manufactured in the United States. That's how they branded it. That's how they marketed it. You saw, somebody, in the store with the orange one in the left hand and the yellow one in the right hand, and they made a conscious decision to pay more for that. But sooner or later, that decision started to migrate. Another example is Harley Davidson. They actually marketed. They did a market study and asked their customers at what percentage of the motorcycle could be made outside of the United States. They didn't really get specific of where. And you would still consider it a made in USA, a brand that you would tattoo on your arm. And the number was 65%. I might be off a few if anybody's out there fact checking me, but that's a true story. I go back to a book that I read shortly after Steve Jobs passed away. It was his biography. And one of the things that I'll never forget about that was that when he developed the iPhone and he knew the potential of it, not only did he want to put the product to manufacturing in China for two reasons. One was their capacity. And I think everybody underestimates the capacity of the United States. But we also have a limit on that, right? We are very productive. We're the most productive nation in the world, but you can't make millions and millions and millions and millions of products without capacity. So understanding where capacities are in the world, resources. I mean, they knew that they couldn't keep up and they couldn't meet the deadlines if they didn't use a manufacturing powerhouse. So China's really not great at designing and developing new products. America is, and other countries around the world are. What China's really good at is mass producing them and doing them cost effectively. The Industrial Revolution in China, has occurred over like the last 20 years, where, in America, we're over 100 years. They do things extremely quickly. One of the machine tools that we commonly buy here, I asked, because we bought the same machines in China, they sold 4,000 machines in 1 year. That was more machines than in the entire history of the sales in North America for that particular Japanese company. So scale and magnitude is something that people generally don't understand. And I think, from a policy standpoint, I'd start looking at those numbers a little bit so you understand the complexity. But we need to continue to develop, manufacture, and innovate here in this country. And the IP is really, really an important element. That's what I would say. I don't know if I did that in 120 seconds or not.
Well said. Well said, Ron.
Amy, we're beginning to see the tip of the iceberg of what the Biden administration is going to do. We're not seeing below the surface, but the continuation of the prohibition on Americans investing in now 49 Chinese companies was continued to some people's surprise, including mine. We've seen an ending of the ban on TikTok and WeChat. We've seen Xiaomi, the manufacturer of handheld kind of cheaper consumer phones, taken off the list. Mm-hmm. What do you think is underneath the tip of this iceberg? Is this telling us where we're going to be, and are the political constraints that you talk about so severe that SMEs really need to have contingency plans for a real worsening of the relationship?
Great question, Steve. Let me say that yes, that the first executive order limiting, basically continuing the Trump administration's executive order and expanding it on limiting Americans' ability to invest in Chinese companies that have ties to the military and the surveillance industry. That was a sign that the Biden administration is comfortable being tough on China, but restrictive. It's not just being tough, it is that they're comfortable restricting trade and investment flows. And this, the WeChat and TikTok issue, what's interesting to me, Steve, is they came out with an executive order that did say we are taking that Trump administration executive order off the books. However, the president asked the Secretary of Commerce to do an investigation into Chinese companies that hold American user data to make sure that these companies don't have their ownership structure and their leaders don't have ties to the Chinese government. And so we're not out of the woods is what I'm saying. Or if I were TikTok or WeChat, I would say ByteDance, the parent company, I would say you're not out of the woods. The Biden administration is comfortable with these kinds of restrictions. User data is clearly a very sensitive issue. But I think to your broader question, what does this mean? The Biden administration really is taking its time in formulating its overall China strategy and has told us that. Katherine Tai has said that on trade policy, and we've heard that across the board, that the administration wants to talk to not only Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, but to Linda's point, to our partners and allies outside of the United States to try to coordinate some China policies. And I think what's happening right now in Europe is the Biden administration is trying to get some consensus built on some of its policies towards China, and probably getting some real pushback. And so I think that is going to shape the outcome of the Biden administration's China policies. I think right now it looks like they're trying to be pretty expansive and restrictive on the trade and investment front. But if they fail to get consensus from Republicans and Democrats here and from partners and allies abroad, I think that's going to impact those policies. And so we do have to be patient, but not complacent. I do think that Katherine Tai just today was talking to the AFL-CIO about a worker-centric trade policy. And as all of us have said today, SMEs have to speak up and really speak out against policies that will undermine their competitiveness rather than help. Because obviously Ambassador Tai and the entire cabinet is very focused on the US economy and economic recovery. So we do have an opportunity in that way to speak out against policies that will undermine rather than support SMEs when it comes to US-China trade.
I think one of the themes I've seen emerge is, to some degree, surprise from Democrats that the administration has been slow in reversing a number of Trump administration policies. And in some case, not only not reversing them, but continuing them. I listened to a screed against Attorney General Merrick Garland last night for continuing Trump's policies on seizures of journalist records, for claiming that a defamation suit brought by a woman who said well, I don't want to go into it, but in any case, they were claiming it was still part of the his work, and that it was perfectly reasonable for him to say this woman who accused him of worse than sexual harassment was, it's impossible. And the Justice Department will continue to defend this. I think Gary would tell you that in labor law, not clear that was within his duties. So I guess my last question for Gary, Linda, and Ron is, okay, if this is the situation, what should you be doing? What should SMEs be doing? Should they be you know, what's the vehicles that they use to reach policymakers? What, you know, and do they put in place a risk mitigation strategy vis-a-vis China? Let me start with Gary.
I think what a lot of companies have learned is that you do need a risk mitigation strategy. And I think particularly over the last several years, you know, the tariffs, the pandemic has put that into clear focus. So I think that's positive. I think that's something that will help companies long term. And at the World Trade Center, and I'll turn it over to Linda, you know, what we're really trying to do is we want to continue those strong relationships that we've built. We also want to be a conduit to letting leadership at both local, state, and federal know how important it is to our member companies, you know, that we, I'll just say, normalize relations with China, and we focus more on the trade side of it. But I'll turn it over to Linda on how we're trying to accomplish some of that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gary. China remains an important market for our region, for our companies, and we will continue to do everything we can to provide the best information possible, relevant information, timely information for our companies so that they can make good, sound business decisions. This is what we've done throughout our 2 decades of experience. We will look at alternatives as it makes sense to provide alternatives into other markets. But again, it's important to remain to support expanding our ties and business with China in whatever ways we can, and doing it prudently and working with our companies so that they have the best information and guidance to be able to do that through vehicles like the China Club. I also look at the World Trade Center of Greater Philadelphia as being a wonderful resource and conduit of information to our congressional delegation and those in Congress that really have an impact on our trade policy, along with the administration, and to be a voice for small business. So we'll look to our continuing to provide that service to our companies. And for our small businesses, whether it's China or any market, to recognize that there are certain fundamentals that you have to maintain in mitigating risk, knowing your customer, having export credit insurance, whatever vehicles are available. So we'll continue to provide advice, recommend good legal counsel. It's a little plug for you, Gary, but I do mean that sincerely as well. So they go into these markets, including China, with eyes wide open, not eyes half shut.
Ron, and also Ron, what are you hearing about when do you expect to next go to China?
Oh,
given the quarantine rules.
Yeah, well, I really hope by the end of the year, you know, we'll see how things develop. But you know, I just want to, you know, give Linda a plug and the World Trade Association of Philadelphia. I mean, you know, I really, you know, look to them, you know, the groups that they, you know, the social events and the content that they have really gives small companies like ours not only a voice, but, you know, information sources and networking that we otherwise wouldn't have. You know, risk mitigation is part of our business strategy. Ever since we went global, you know, we realized that we needed to have that as part of it. So, you know, China in itself, you know, I think the relationships there are really, really strong. And I really don't see, let's just say, a couple of administrations, you know, tearing that up. So, you know, it's just much deeper than that. You know, China looks at things in much larger time periods. We tend to look at things, you know, based on elections every 2 to 4 years, I think. You know, I just think they're looking past that. I think, you know, that you know, is the way I run my business too. We have a short term and a long term, a medium term and a long term plan. And that long term plan is, you know, out 10, 15 years. So I don't see our company not dealing with China in 10 to 15 years. So I certainly hope, you know, because of how much we rely on them and how much they rely on us. So, you know, that's a very small point on the graph here from a small company, but I do believe that that's something that we should be looking at. So I'll just end with that. I will say that, I do miss China. It's not just, going as a chore. I miss the culture. I miss the people, and believe it or not, I miss the food. So I've learned how to cook some of their dishes at home just so I could get the real Chinese food. So.
Well, like you, Ron, it's the longest I have not been to China in 42 years.
Wow.
So it's I miss it too. But hopefully by year end, optimistically by year end, less optimistically at some point in 2022.
Yeah.
You can get a visa, Ron. You just will need to quarantine.
I know the problem is I can't stay in the hotel that I'd like to,
That's right. Yes. And you're really confined to the hotel room. Well, I want to thank all four of you for giving so generously of your time. This has been a fascinating, wonderful program. I want to thank the World Trade Center Association for cooperating with us on this program. It's been great. I hope we've brought it down from, the macro discussion down to how it impacts SMEs throughout the United States, using the Philadelphia area as an example. But thank you all so much for joining us, and thank our audience for being with us. Thanks.
Thank you.
For more interviews, videos, and links to events like this one, visit us at www.ncuscr.org.